Hi. I've spent many years working with harmony, chords, composing, arranging, and many years teaching people these things as well. And a question that keeps coming up is, even when people have done quite a bit of harmony or composing or whatever, they're always worried about which chords best progress onto which other chords. And lots of people ask for kind of blueprints of, well, if I had a sequence of chords that would always work in this situation, what would it be? And it's possible to talk about these things. It kind of comes with a slight musical health warning, because you don't always want to be stuck in some kind of straitjacket of always having chord 1 followed by chord 4 followed by chord 5 followed by chord 1. You know, it will sound okay, but there may be times in your musical life when you want to kind of branch out and do something else. And there are lots of exciting things you can do, of course, when it comes to using chromatic chords like diminished sevenths and augmented sixths and Neapolitan chords and all these things. Things you can do to modulate between keys, little touches of colour like secondary dominants, all these things, which I'm not really talking about in this film. But if you're just in a key and you've got the chords of that key handy, and you want to know, well, how does this chord progress well? This table is designed to give you some help with that one. So let's just explore it a little bit and see what we're doing. Now, chord 3 is not a chord that you would generally use very often, but it's a perfectly reasonable chord to use. And some people always avoid chord 3 like the plague. But you don't have to do that. But you're not going to use chord 3 all over your piece, probably. But in a major key, because we're talking about chord progressions in major keys, come back to another film on minor keys. If you have chord 3, the best progression from chord 3 is to go on to a chord 6. So however you organise things, chord 3 is usually best followed by chord 6. And one reason why we tell people to avoid chord 3, personally I don't really, but a lot of people do this, they just say avoid chord 3, it's too much trouble. But the trouble is that sometimes chord 3 progresses onto another chord and the progression doesn't sound too good. So 3 onto 6 is usually the way to handle that. But if you're starting with chord 6, I mean, you don't have to flow through this in any order. If you're starting with a chord 6 and you're thinking, well, I wonder what would follow chord 6 well, this table's suggesting that you could go to chord 4 or go to chord 2. So if I've got chord 6 and I go to chord 4, it sounds like this. Or if I've got chord 6 and I go to chord 2, it sounds like this. So you can hear both of those progressions work very nicely. If you've got chord 4, well, you could follow that with a chord 2. So I've got chord 4 and I'm following it with chord 2. So that's quite a good progression. Or if you want to do something else with 4, you might think about going on to chord 7. Now, chord 7 is often the chord that people say, whatever you do, don't use chord 7. Try not to use chord 3, but whatever you do, don't use chord 7. Actually, chord 7 is jolly useful. But chord 7 generally doesn't work very well in root position, but it does work very well in its first inversion. The reason it doesn't work well in root position is because it's a diminished chord and it sounds a little bit ugly in root position. Put it in first inversion, you'll find it works quite well. So if you wanted to go from a chord 4 and then you wanted to go to a 7B chord, you can see that that might actually work well. So you could, on this table, go from 4 to 7B to 1. So 4, 7B, 1. So you see that's quite a good strong progression, isn't it? So there's a 7B. You might want to go from 2 to a 7B. So here's a 2 and then a 7B and then possibly onto a 1 from there. So you see how that works quite nicely as well. You can go from 2 to 5, 2 to 5, and then that quite often gets followed by 1. So lots of cadences go 2, 5, 1. 7B progresses onto 1, but it also progresses onto 5. So we could have a 7B chord and then go on to a 5 and then possibly onto a 1. So lots of different ways of dealing with progressions using these kind of chords. And of course, once you get to chord 1, well, really any chord will follow on from there. So if you're wanting just to feel a little bit more confident about chord progressions, I'm not necessarily saying learn this table, but you might want to play around with this and try doing all the different permutations of progressions in different keys. And then you might try following it through. So for example, if I follow this top line all the way through, what does it sound like if I have chord 3, followed by chord 6, followed by chord 4, and then followed by a 7B chord, followed by a chord 1. You see that actually progresses quite well. But I could go another route. I could go down this way. So chord 3, followed by chord 6, followed by chord 2, followed by chord 5, followed by chord 1. And I can take any other route through that. So it's not suggesting that you always start on chord 3. That's not the idea at all. It's just that when you have 3, it's normally best to follow it with a 6. It's not a rule, but it normally works best. But here are other chords that you'll find yourself bumping into all the time and various routes that go through it. So you might find it quite helpful just to explore that table of progressions.